imagine an empire so vast it touches the horizon. A civilization that gave us laws, roads, and a vision of order that would echo for millennia. This was Rome, a titan of history. But titans can fall, and Rome's fall wasn't a single cataclysmic event. It was a slow, agonizing bleed, started by a single repeated mistake, a crisis of leadership. This isn't just a story about crumbling statues and forgotten legions. It's a warning, a tale of how the greatest empire on earth tore itself apart from the inside, one bad choice at a time. It all begins not on the battlefield, but in the heart of power, the emperor's throne. For centuries, the transfer of power in Rome was relatively stable. But then came the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of pure chaos. Imagine a world where your country had a new leader almost every single year. 26 emperors in 50 years, and nearly all of them met a violent end. They weren't chosen for their wisdom or their vision for the empire. They were generals, propped up by their loyal legions, who saw the throne not as a responsibility, but as the ultimate prize. This constant turmoil created a deep, festering wound in the Roman psyche. How could you trust a government that was constantly at war with itself? How could you plan for the future when the emperor who made a promise today would likely be dead tomorrow? The very idea of Rome, this stable, eternal entity, began to crumble. People stopped thinking of themselves as Romans first. Instead, their loyalty shifted. It was to their local governor, their general, or just to their own survival. The social contract was broken. The trust that held the empire together was evaporating like morning mist. Every time a general decided he'd look better in purple, he didn't just march on Rome. He pulled his legions from where they were most needed, the frontiers, the Rhine, the Danube, the borders with Persia. These weren't just lines on a map. They were the shield of the empire, manned by its best soldiers. But now, those soldiers were turning their swords not against barbarian invaders, but against their fellow Romans. Think of it like this: your house is surrounded by threats, but instead of guarding the doors and windows, the security guards are all fighting each other in the living room for control of the TV remote. It's madness. While Roman armies were busy slaughtering each other in battles like Mursa Major, where tens of thousands of the empire's best troops died in a single day, the real enemies were watching. Goths, Franks, Alemanni. They saw the open gates. They saw an empire distracted, bleeding itself dry. These civil wars were unbelievably costly. They drained the treasury to pay for troops who were fighting other troops. They destroyed farmland, disrupted trade, and, most importantly, they squandered Rome's most precious resource, its trained professional soldiers. A legionary took years to train. He was a walking investment in the security of the state. And now, they were being killed by the thousands, not by external foes, but by their own countrymen in a pointless struggle for power. After each civil war, the winner would find himself on the throne of a weaker, poorer, and less secure empire. He'd have fewer soldiers to guard a frontier that was now under even greater pressure. He'd have to raise taxes on a population that was already suffering just to rebuild the army he had just helped destroy. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of destruction. The solution to the last crisis became the cause of the next one. Eventually, the empire was stretched so thin it had to make a desperate choice. With not enough Roman soldiers to go around, emperors began hiring foreign mercenaries to defend the borders. Entire tribes of Goths and Franks were paid to fight for Rome. On the surface, it seemed like a clever solution, but they were outsourcing their own survival. These mercenaries had no deep-rooted loyalty to the idea of Rome. Their allegiance was to gold and to their own tribal leaders. And here is the final, fatal turn. The Romans were now teaching their future enemies how to fight like Romans. They gave them training, equipment, and a front-row seat to Roman military tactics and weaknesses. The so-called barbarians were no longer a disorganized mob. They were becoming a mirror image of the Roman army, but with one crucial difference: they were united, while Rome was still fractured. So when a leader like Alaric the Goth came along, he wasn't just a raider. He was a product of the Roman system. He had served in the Roman army. He knew its strengths and, more importantly, its many, many weaknesses. When he and his men sacked the city of Rome in 410 AD, it was a shock to the world. But it shouldn't have been. It was the logical conclusion of centuries of internal conflict. The guards Rome had hired to protect the house had finally decided to burn it down and take what was left. The final collapse in the West wasn't a grand battle. It was a quiet fizzle. By 476, the Roman emperor was a powerless teenager, and a Germanic chieftain simply told him his services were no longer required. The empire didn't fall to a mighty external invasion. It was hollowed out from within, rotted by political instability, endless civil wars, and a complete failure of leadership. The barbarians didn't knock down the door. They just walked through a door that had been left wide open. So why does this ancient story matter to us here now? Because the parallels are chilling. We see it in the erosion of trust in our institutions, in the fierce political divisions that make us see our neighbors as enemies, in leaders who prioritize personal power over the common good. The story of Rome is a timeless lesson. It teaches us that the greatest threats to any society, no matter how powerful, rarely come from the outside. They come from within. It's a reminder that unity is not a given. It's a fragile thing that must be constantly nurtured. And that the moment we lose faith in each other, the moment we start fighting over the ruins, we have already begun to fall. Thank you for watching. If this story from the past gives you something to think about for our future, consider subscribing for more journeys into history. See you next time.